Welcome to this virtual reunion session. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Professor Chris Knittel. Chris is the George P. Shultz Professor and a Professor of Applied Economics at MIT Sloan. He is also the Director of MIT's Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, which has served as the hub for social science research on energy and the environment for more than 4 decades. Chris's research focuses on environmental economics, studying how firms and consumers respond to policies. We are delighted to have him here. Chris, if you'll turn your camera on and join us, I'll let you take it away.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And thanks for having me, and thank you to all the alum who are attending this session. As Lauren mentioned, I wear a few hats at MIT. I'm a professor of applied economics, where I teach an energy economics and policy class to MBA students and MIT undergrads. And then I direct the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, which, as Lauren mentioned, is the hub for social science and policy work related to energy and the environment. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today draws on that research. So my 12-year-old son, who one day wants to be a YouTube star, showed me a neat little trick where I won't share my screen. I'll just jump in front of my slides. So we'll do it this way today. What I'm going to be talking about to you is some recent work that I did with Thomas Green, who is now graduated, but was a master's student in the Technology and Public Policy program at MIT. And this work, the focus of this work is to understand what the distributional impacts of climate policies are, to better inform policymakers to make better policy, and to hopefully protect or at least shelter some at-risk groups within the US as it relates to climate policy. And this is part of a larger project that is being run through the center I run, the CEPR, we call it for short. And this is known as the Roosevelt Project, and it's led by former Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz. And I won't read this verbatim. I'll just tell you that the Roosevelt Project is a interdisciplinary group of researchers at MIT and Harvard, social scientists, hard scientists, technologists, and so on. And the goal of the Roosevelt Project is to better understand how we could transition to a low carbon economy without leaving behind those certain groups that I mentioned before. History's littered with lots of transitions that have left certain groups behind. And what we hope to do is provide a framework, or at least a set of tools for policymakers to keep that from happening as we decarbonize the economy. Why Roosevelt? Well, Ernie Moniz drew on 3 legendary titans, Roosevelt titans, all of which focused either on protecting at-risk communities or protecting the environment. So the Roosevelt Project seemed like a perfect combination of those 2 goals. The Roosevelt Project has 2 phases. We finished the first and we're in the middle of the second. The first phase was a series of white papers that the researchers wrote to take stock of where we are in terms of decarbonization, what we know about certain transitions in the past, and the budding transition that we were in the middle of in terms of decarbonizing, and where we have to go. So I believe there's about 10 or so working papers. They're available at this link below or off of the CEPR website, if you just remember cepr.mit.edu. And they cover a variety of topics. Here are a few highlights. So the social impacts of an energy transition is one. The distributional impacts of climate policy, which I'm going to talk about today. One paper focuses on the infrastructure needs, a timely topic given the Biden administration's infrastructure proposal. And there's a typo there, but and one also looks at the public opinions around decarbonization and the climate. The second phase, as I mentioned, we're in the middle of, and here we're actually going into 4 areas in the US to work with local community leaders, local policymakers, the boots on the ground, so to speak, and to use the insights that we've gathered from those white papers and collaborate with those local partners to build a plan, so to speak, on how those communities can decarbonize while at the same time advancing the interests of the communities most at risk inside each of those 4 areas. So one is in the Appalachia, where there's lots of coal mining and natural gas fracking. One is in the industrial heartland, where we'll have to see a transition from internal combustion-based engine vehicles to electric vehicles, as well as a decarbonization of industry, which many believe is going to be one of the toughest places to decarbonize. Another is in the Gulf Coast, where obviously their livelihoods depend greatly on oil. And then another is in New Mexico, where they're consumers of coal and consumers of fossil fuels more generally. So please look out on the CEPR website for the lessons we learned from this second phase of the Roosevelt Project. All right, so back to what I really wanted to focus on, which is my little slice or my white paper in this larger Roosevelt Project. And what were the goals here? So what we sought to understand was the distributional impacts. So, and we're going to look all the way down to a census tract level. So what is a census tract? There's about 70,000 census tracts in the US, and they each have about 4,000 people living in them. So the first step or the first goal here is to understand how carbon footprints vary across all these 70,000 census tracts. And then to understand, how that depends on geography, where in the US you are, what I'm going to call urbanity, whether or not you're in a city, a suburban area, or a rural area. We can look across race, across income, across the whole host of socioeconomic indicators and other variables of interest. And then once we see those carbon footprints at such a fine level, we can think about what different policies would do to those different households. And there's a lot of different policies that we can or are likely to rely on to decarbonize. The economist's favorite, and I'll come back to this in a while, is to put a price on carbon. You might have heard discussions about carbon taxes or cap and trade. Other policies are like a clean energy standard, which the Biden administration has proposed and many states have. We have renewable portfolio standards. There's lots of different choices. So the second goal of this project was to understand how all of those different choices impact all of these different households. And then the third, which is more for a public good, is to provide these carbon footprints at such a fine level to other researchers to answer lots of different questions. So I'm not going to go into a ton of details. I'm going to show you lots of maps, but I'll just mention that these slides are going to draw on these 3 recent working papers of mine. And again, those are available on the CEPR website as well. All right, so this project itself, the Roosevelt Project, has two parts, and this paper has 2 parts as well. The first part is so you might think this should exist, but it doesn't exist anywhere. You can't just go look up carbon footprints at a household level. There's actually not even a decent data set that gives you a pretty good idea of carbon footprints across the US at a household level. So the first and the meat of the methodological part of this paper is to use machine learning techniques that will translate a lot of different data sets we have out there already that are representative of US households, and use those machine learning techniques to train a model and then effectively predict electricity consumption, gasoline consumption, natural gas consumption, everything that has a carbon footprint at a household level for the entire US. And so there's a lot of machinery that goes into that. And if you're interested in the details, either happy to talk about them during the chat, or I can send the paper or talk offline. And then the second part, once we have those, is to think about what the policies would do to each of those products, whether it's electricity, gasoline, vehicles, and so on. So we don't capture everything in a household carbon footprint, but we capture about 70%. I'll say the big part that we're missing is air travel. We don't have a good data set, a representative data set that can be used to build that machine learning model. So I just wanted you to have that caveat in mind. And again, I won't go through all of this, but effectively, we take a data set that's representative of the US, build our machine learning model, predictive model, use census data that is for the entire US at the census tract level to plug into that machine learning model. And then that gives us predictions or forecasts of carbon footprints for every census tract in the US. Let me start with some maps now. So first, a map of total carbon footprints, and then I'm going to cut that into pieces after that. So this to me is very striking. And I've given this talk a lot to policymakers and is often very eye-opening here. So the more purple you are, or the more black you are actually, the larger your carbon footprint. And I probably don't have to tell you this, but what the results show is carbon footprints on the coasts are very low, not so much in the Northeast, and I'll get to why that is in a second. But in the middle of the US, carbon footprints are very high. And now just take this map and think through the politics of climate policy. It's not too surprising that representatives, congressional representatives, other local policymakers might be a little bit more resistant to climate change policy in the middle of the US than they are on the coast. And, for the very reason that those policies are likely to hit their constituents harder than those on the coast. And that's just a fact, and a fact that we're going to have to deal with and address directly for decarbonization to be successul. Another empirical fact that comes from our efforts is that there's a sort of a donut hole around urban environments. And this also makes intuitive sense, but we're able to put numbers to this, specific numbers to this. Carbon footprints are very low in the cities, high in the suburbia, and even a little bit higher in rural America. And that's another fact that policymakers are going to have to address directly for decarbonization to be successful. So when we think through about building policies and designing policies to decarbonize, I hope everybody listening to this, our goal should be sustainable policies. Sort of a pun or a play on words, but I want climate policy that can withstand a change in the White House, a change in the Senate, a change in Congress. And in order to get those sustainable policies, we're going to need to address these two empirical facts head on. So that was total carbon footprints. I'll just more briefly go over carbon footprints at a product level. So this is electricity. And here, one reason why you see very defined state borders or borders is that the US electricity market is really cut into three main grids. If you followed the Texas fiasco, you probably learned that Texas is its own grid. Then we have a Western and an Eastern grid as well. And inside of those grids are what are called NERC subregions, which if I moved, you would see the map of the NERC subregions. And we're defining the carbon content of the electricity at the NERC subregion level. That would actually be an open question for policymakers as to what the carbon number they would use for any electricity-based climate policy. But here again, you see very, very different carbon footprints at the electricity level. This is a function of not only the carbon footprint of the electrons that you're using, but how many electrons you're using as well. Natural gas, which is predominantly used for heating in the US, you see more, again, heterogeneity across the US. Some areas, if you live in the Northeast, you know about heating oil. If you don't live in the Northeast, you probably don't. But some areas use effectively diesel for heat as well. So that's why the Northeast has a higher carbon footprint than most of the other coastal areas. Heating oil is a very carbon intensive way to heat your home. And in even other areas, you might use propane instead of natural gas or heating oil. And then we also have gasoline. Now, this isn't as stark as electricity or natural gas, but you do see a redder area in the middle of the US than everywhere else. And this is a function of how many miles you drive and the average fuel economy of the vehicles we drive. We build a machine learning model on products and services. It doesn't fit well, I'll be totally honest. It's mostly capturing income differences and how much money we spent, but that's an important factor in household carbon footprints. Okay, I'm gonna skip that and just show you, that it is true that if we split things up by congressional district and we look at the distribution of carbon footprints across Democrats and Republican areas or congressional districts, we see higher carbon footprints in Republican areas relative to Democrat areas, but there's actually a lot of overlap there. So my hope actually is that that's the room for negotiation, the room for agreement in the fact that it isn't as though the Democrat areas are completely carbon free and the Republican areas are not. So there's a lot of discussion that can take place to protect different socioeconomic and other groups. All right, so now let me just talk a little bit about policies. So we run through a number of policies in the paper. I'm going to focus actually on three. One is the economist's favorite policy to decarbonize, which I mentioned earlier, which is a carbon tax or a price on carbon. Not only do we look at a price on carbon, but even in this talk, the big question on a price on carbon, not only the level of the price, but what you're going to do with the revenues. So I'm going to show you what happens if we recycle those revenues in two different ways. Besides that, the policies that the Biden administration has focused on and the US has focused on more generally are things like fuel economy standards. CAFE standards, if you've heard that term, where we regulate the average fuel efficiency of new vehicles, or what's known as a clean energy standard, where you force a certain share of the electrons in an electricity grid to be from carbon-free technologies. That can be renewables like solar and wind, or a clean energy standard would also allow for nuclear electricity to count as well. That is slightly different than what is also discussed regularly, which is known as a renewable portfolio standard. RPSs and clean energy standards, or CESs, differ in how they treat nuclear. In a renewable portfolio standard, nuclear is not an option. Only solar, wind, hydro, sometimes biomass, and geothermal. So those are the sets of policies that I'm going to show you how they impact different households using those same maps. So first, a little test of how much from 15010 you remember. So what does a tax on carbon do? Well, a tax on carbon is a tax that the size of which depends on the carbon content of the product. So if supply was horizontal, what that would do is shift up supply by the amount of the tax, and the price would shift up by that same amount. If you remember, the tax revenue that's generated from that is actually going to depend on the slope of the demand curve. I'm going to ignore that little triangle for a second and just change the prices of all those goods that we modeled, electricity, natural gas, and heating oil, and so on, by their carbon content times the price of carbon in this environment, and calculate that rectangle. and that's the revenue generated from that tax. And then once we have this giant pot of money, I'm going to distribute that revenue back via lump sum checks. So you don't lose the efficiency benefit that you get from the tax because the checks don't depend on how much you're paying of the tax. And then by doing that, we can look to see which households actually make money under the carbon tax and which households lose money, and whether or not that is the types of households we want to be making money and the types of households we want to be paying their more than their fair share, so to speak. And in the paper, we look at a bunch of different revenue recycling plans. I'm going to start with what I would call a vanilla tax and dividend plan, where we just send the same check to every household across the US. So we grab that pot of money, we divide it by the number of households in the US, and we send that check back. And then the second one I'm going to show you will send a different check depending on which census region you live in and whether or not you live in a city, a suburban area, or a rural area. And you send me your favorite type of tax and dividend plan, and I could sort of run it through the numbers, but those are the two I'll focus on today. The other policies are a little bit more complicated to measure, although I've done some work in this on this front, so we know how to do it. It's just a little bit more complicated than that rectangle I showed you. But I'm going to show you what happens if we strengthen fuel economy standards, and I'm going to show you what happens if we were to do a national clean energy standard. Now, backing up a little bit, so since I'm an economist, I'm contractually compelled to try to convince you carbon pricing is the right way to do things. It might sound like a joke, but it's not. My license plate is actually tax CO2. So I live and breathe this stuff for a living. But just one slide on why pricing the externality is the way to go here. The starting point is why we love markets in the first place. Markets are great ways to organize economic activity. The problem with markets around fossil fuels and anything that generates greenhouse gases is that there's a cost to society that nobody is paying for at the moment, and that's the cost of climate change. So that input costs into your gallon of gasoline or your electron of electricity is free, and we get the wrong set of prices. So the reason why economists like carbon taxes is it relies on all the same reasons why we love markets, and it fixes the market directly and leads to the efficient outcome, so to speak. That's the first reason, and I've done a lot of work showing that carbon pricing is usually 1/10 the cost of decarbonizing via some other way. And one of the papers I showed you earlier builds on that or updates that work as well. And you could actually go to California right now and see that California has a number of different policies to decarbonize their economy, one of which is a price on carbon, their cap and trade market. And another is what's known as a low carbon fuel standard. And the low carbon fuel standard permits are trading for almost 10 times the cost of the permits under cap and trade. So that's showing you on the margin, if you remember that term from 010, that the decarbonizing under the low carbon fuel standard is costing California 10 times as much as under the cap and trade policy. So efficiency is one reason. The other reason is that price on carbon generates revenues. Just about any climate policy we adopt is at the beginning is going to be regressive. It's going to hurt low-income households more than wealthy households. So if we want to protect those households, we're going to need a revenue source for that protection. A clean energy standard doesn't have a revenue source. CAFE standards don't have revenue sources. So if you're going to adopt a clean energy standard, you're also going to simultaneously have to adopt a new tax somewhere else to generate revenue to undo the regressive nature of the clean energy standard. Maybe we can do that, but it seems more efficient to just adopt the right policy that already generates revenues to protect those low-income households. And And that's a second reason why economists tend to favor a price on carbon. All right, so what does that vanilla price on carbon look like? Well, it sort of looks like the map of carbon footprints, right? It's the width of that rectangle I showed you before is your carbon footprint, and the height is the tax on the product. So not surprisingly, even though we're handing out all the money we collect, what's happening under that vanilla tax and dividend plan is we're sending a lot of money from middle America to the coast, because middle America is paying more in taxes than they're getting back, and the coasts are paying less in taxes than they're getting back. So it's actually a money generator for the coast and a money draw for middle America. Again, that's probably a recipe for disaster, or certainly a very unsustainable carbon policy. But we don't have to do that. And I'll get to that in a second. I will say, though, that even that vanilla carbon tax has a few positive features. For one, is it is progressive. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but let me focus on this one right here for a moment. So what these are the distributions of the impacts of your net check, so to speak, the net carbon costs of this policy. This is the lowest income quintile, so the bottom 20% of household income earners. And you can see that the vast majority of those lowest income households make money off of the vanilla tax and dividend plan. Their net revenue is above zero. Whereas if we go to the highest income group, most of the highest income group is paying more than they're getting back as a check. To me, that's a positive feature of a policy like this. So it is a progressive policy, but what it ignores is that middle America issue. So we check the box in terms of protecting low-income households, but we don't check the box in terms of protecting certain geographic areas. And if another somewhat negative outcome is that the urban areas are making money and the rural areas on average are losing more money. So if we go to the suburbia and the rural areas, you can see a bigger chunk of the low-income households in rural areas are losing money on the deal, whereas almost no low-income urban household is losing money. So that might be a design flaw that we might want to rectify. How much money is getting sent from different income levels to others? Well, so the average top quintile household is giving about $300 to the low income quintiles. The average second to the top 20% is giving about $100, and then the middle quintile, basically it's a wash, and that money is flowing to the lower two quintiles. That's the good feature. The bad feature is rural America is giving about $300 to urban America in that vanilla tax and dividend plan. But what we show in the paper is we can design that dividend plan in any way you want. So if instead you send a different level of check by the 10 census divisions in the US and by urban, suburbia, and rural, then it starts to wash out that middle America problem. Right? All the money tax revenue stays in the census division. So it's going to be net neutral within any census division. And I won't go through this as much detail, but these graphs look a lot better if we just make that one tweak to the carbon tax and dividend plan. Just more quickly, I will cover the other policies. So fuel economy standards don't look any better. They too, if you look at a lot of red in middle America, they're on average buying vehicles of lower fuel economy, so they're getting taxed more under fuel economy standards, and there's no revenue to undo any of those potential negative outcomes. Clean energy standard depends a lot on what the grid is like. So because the grid is cleaner over here and over here, the clean energy standard is going to send money from where the grid is dirty to where the grid is clean. and again, not generate any revenue to undo those potential negative outcomes. So even though there's some things that we might not view as perfect under pricing carbon, those tend to be worse in these other policies. So let me wrap up with some general lessons. One is that carbon footprints vary across a lot of dimensions. I only showed you really two: urbanity and geography, and somewhat income. But in the paper, we really decompose carbon footprints into a number of different socioeconomic variables. And what this shows us is that the incidence of different carbon tax policies and different climate change policies more generally are going to vary by those same variables that carbon footprints vary by. And that, from the economist perspective at least, is an important variable or an important set of facts that we need to address in designing whatever climate policy we end up relying on. And what we hope to show is that not only is income important, which there's a lot of focus on income, but geography might be just as, if not more important. And then finally, when we go into the nitty-gritties of policy design, we can design carbon tax and dividend plans to safeguard whatever group we would like. And it doesn't actually complicate things too much. And that's going to be tougher to do for these policies that, sadly, I think we're more likely to rely on, things like clean energy standards and fuel economy standards, or EV subsidies, and so on. So hopefully policymakers can learn from our analysis and design better policies going forward. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you so much. That was incredibly informative. We have fantastic questions coming in from alumni, and I would encourage anyone who would like to enter a question in the Q&A box. I'll start out with a comment on often some questions around climate change messaging include the focus on individual actions rather than companies or corporations who have a much higher carbon footprint. And I wondered if you could address, we discussed individual household carbon footprints in this talk. Could you talk about how a carbon tax might affect larger entities?
Yeah, so it's certainly the case that there's a lot of exciting commitments being made by large corporations, and corporations are obviously just as important as households in decarbonizing the grid. You know, a carbon tax is obviously going to incentivize a lot of changes inside of an organization or a corporation, whether it's choosing lower carbon ways to make their product, or to decarbonize in other facets of their business. So we've done a lot of work on what the impacts are going to be across sectors, and we're actually doing a fair bit of work right now at CEPR, looking at how it's going to impact countries across the globe as well, and what do we do for imports of those products. So it's definitely the case that the price on carbon is the right way to do it for corporations as well, and that the impacts are going to vary across industry and across firms within an industry as well. But that again is the most efficient way to decarbonize, and also generates revenues that if we wanted to protect certain sectors of the economy, we could with those revenues.
Thank you for that. And your comment about global ties into another question addressing worldwide issues, which is the US following IPCC carbon footprint accounting or setting up an alternative carbon accounting system? How does this or not help global coordination?
Yeah, so that hasn't been announced by the Biden administration because there hasn't been a specific plan as of yet. My hunch is that they would follow IPCC guidelines on that going forward, but I look forward to seeing the specifics of the Biden plan.
You really are providing so many wonderful segues to my future questions. So thank you. Speaking of the Biden plan, one of the questions was, with Biden's latest order, specifically regarding companies reporting their carbon emissions, how soon do you see these norms being implemented and seeing those effects?
Yeah, so we're already starting to see that, and there was a few big outcomes in the oil industry last week as well, where boards and shareholders are putting pressure even on the oil industry to be more upfront with their carbon accounting and carbon footprints. So I would expect, within the next couple of years that we'll have very specific guidelines on how that will roll out. And I don't think it'll be much of a burden on many industries, because I think they were already going in that direction.
That's great. Speaking of specific industries, one person asked about the effect on food production, much of which happens in rural areas. And does that affect the cost of food, the effect on those areas?
Yeah, so it depends on how we design our climate policy. So often agriculture this is somewhat of a loaded term, so I don't mean it to be this loaded, but they get somewhat of a free lunch, so to speak, in climate policy. Often that they're a source of what are called offsets, where firms can get out of their tax obligations by doing something in the agricultural industry. So it's certainly possible to design climate policy that would insulate the agriculture and the meat industry, but at the same time that there are ways that the agricultural industry can change to decarbonize and to lower their carbon footprint. So we want to keep those incentives alive. But let's be honest, if we were to start taxing carbon and taxing carbon production from methane from cattle, or fertilizer use, or tilling practices, that would put upward pressure on food prices. And that's exactly why we have to be smart with what we do with the money generated from that carbon tax, and allocate it in a way that protects the most food insecure among us, to undo those impacts.
Absolutely. And one of the alums actually asked whether politicians might prefer to keep those revenues for other purposes. Now, maybe that's beyond your scope, but would love to hear your perspective on that.
No, so in Massachusetts, the two most recent carbon pricing bills really highlighted that issue. One was a totally revenue neutral, all the money got sent back to households, and another was what's known as revenue positive. And actually, many environmental groups are the ones that are most pushing for revenue policy carbon pricing bills, where you would use those revenues for other things like subsidizing solar or electric vehicles. And obviously that's a big pot of money that policymakers would love to do something with.
Right.
My own view is that once you start using the revenue to do things, unfortunately, what we often use that revenue for is in and of itself regressive. So you're generating revenue in a regressive way, and then you're handing out money for photovoltaic subsidies or Tesla subsidies and so on. So it becomes a doubly regressive way to subsidize those other products. I just think it's cleaner and more, and has a lot of distributional benefits if we just send the money back as a dividend plan.
And it kind of ties into a universal basic income concept, which is people.
It would, it's very much like in Alaska, every resident gets a check based on the oil fund. So it does serve as a universal basic income to some degree.
And trusting families to do what they need to with money that we give them. Okay, you mentioned solar and electric vehicles. One person asked about the future of creating hydrogen for both electricity storage and a transportation fuel.
It's funny, hydrogen ebbs and flows in terms of its focus. There's a lot of focus right now among the technologists on hydrogen. The big benefit, I'll say from the economist's perspective, the big benefit from hydrogen is that it's a fuel that cuts across all of the sectors that currently generate greenhouse gas emissions. And so we could use the hydrogen, we could put it in cars and run it through a fuel cell and drive our electric vehicles. We could run it through a fuel cell and power our houses. We can store the hydrogen. There's a lot of discussion now of storing it as ammonia instead of hydrogen because it's more stable that way. It's probably at least in my view, one of the only ways to decarbonize heavy duty trucking, although there's the Tesla heavy duty truck, the only way to decarbonize shipping. I'm working with some people in aeronautics right now on thinking about 50 years in advance how we're going to decarbonize air travel. So there are a lot of potential uses for hydrogen. It's still expensive. The way we would do it cleanly, brown hydrogen is not expensive. It comes as a byproduct of gasoline refining. But we would use what's called electrolysis to make it from water, and that's still very expensive. So that's where a lot of the focus is on in terms of the R&D. And if we crack that, then hydrogen can be a very exciting fuel going forward.
That's great and a really helpful overview. Thank you. We have a question suggesting treating the world as one big market and dividing the carbon tax revenues in a palatable manner, bringing up India and China. Is that a possible approach?
Well, certainly the most efficient carbon price is a world carbon tax. So from an efficiency standpoint, that's what we would want to do. Now, what you're suggesting is interesting in the sense that we want to have one giant pot of money and then send the same level of check. And obviously that same level of check is going to mean a lot more in India and China than it would in the US. I don't know if that's a recipe for getting that through Congress. But I will say that there's a lot of potential efficiency gains, and this is not a very popular subject among policymakers, but there are a lot of efficiency gains from sending resources outside of the developed world into the less developed world. That there's a lot of low-hanging fruit over there, and there's a lot of other concerns in India and China than the climate. So it might, and look, this is my opinion, but I can't fault India for wanting more electricity and wanting more air conditioning and so on and so forth. Climate might not be the top of their list. So I do think that there's a lot of potential gains from, and this is what the COPs are meant to handle, but a lot of potential gains from sending resources from wealthy countries to less wealthy countries in some way.
Absolutely. We talked about food earlier, and we have a question that really is just water with a question mark following it. I think that is the breadth of that question, but can you speak to that a bit? Well,
now we're getting into climate science, but climate change itself is going to make droughts more prevalent, or certainly the distribution of water across years more varied. So we'll have lots of wet years and lots of very, very dry years. And those droughts tend to happen in places that produce a lot of food. So this is a reason why we need to address climate change in the first place, but also a reason that we need to adapt to climate change going forward in terms of where and how we grow our food. And the other thing I'll mention around water is water markets tend to be very screwed up. In the sense that we don't price water correctly. It's often used because it's subsidized or free, or even we've done some work where it has basically a negative price in some areas in California. It's not used very efficiently. So that's another area where we're going to have to redesign markets in the face of climate change.
Tomorrow, we're hosting an impact investing session that is going to touch on the concept of greenwashing. So spending more time and money on marketing their climate change efforts than the actual efforts. Does that tie into this work at all? Have you seen that addressed?
It doesn't directly, but this is why we need policy. I'll say, it's great when households buy a hybrid or electric vehicle to have an impact, or even firms make commitments they don't have to make to decarbonize. But clearly, there's not enough incentive to do those sorts of things to fix climate change. Actually, my frustration often is that those might hide or sort of give policymakers allow them to skate and not do the hard work. We can't rely on voluntary decarbonization efforts to fix climate change. By definition, we can't. It's, if remember back to 15010, it's an externality for a reason. So we need policymakers to actually make the greenwashing not greenwashing, right? We need to make firms and households change their behavior, and we can do it in a way that protects certain sectors and certain households. So it's not, doesn't have to cost all the sectors or all the households something. It can actually be a money generating set of policies for those at risk households.
I am nodding vigorously behind the screen. So. And any of our alumni who attended the most recent virtual Better World event that was focused on climate change, I think that was something featuring a lot of MIT faculty that really highlighted the urgency of that situation. If you could ask our alumni or offer suggestions for how they could act or what they could lobby their own companies for that might bring a greater impact, what would you suggest?
Yeah, so I think our best efforts are, and this will dovetail off of what I just said, I think our best efforts are spent lobbying our policymakers to do something, to adopt policy. Again, I try to live as low of a carbon life as I can, but my decision is going to pale in, if we were to adopt a 50-cent carbon tax, not $50, it would swamp what I can do, and would probably swamp what many firms can do. So the more we focus on getting policymakers to force them to do the hard work, the work that we send them to DC and Sacramento and Beacon Hill to do, the better the outcomes are going to be.
So as alumni are lobbying politicians for this, can you, and I think we'll wrap up on this question, can you end with how climate change and the urgency of it is kind of separate from partisanship, and how people can approach that with politicians and with companies?
Yeah, I talk a lot with a lot of policymakers on both sides of the aisle, and there's an awakening happening in the Republican Party, and it started with Republicans in Florida and in the coastal areas, and is spreading to Republicans in agricultural areas. It's becoming, I think, the fact that climate change is real is becoming less partisan, I would say. And there's been a lot of polling that has shown young Republicans are on board with doing something about the climate. So there's some changes within the party in terms of demographics as well. So I wouldn't be as afraid to broach this subject with both sides of the aisle these days. There's a big disconnect on what to do. And ironically enough, pricing pollution started as a Republican way to deal with the environment. A little bit of a history lesson that ties into Sloan, actually. But in the 1980s, under Bush Sr., George Bush Sr. adopted cap and trade for nitrogen oxide emissions, which is what causes smog, or a precursor of smog, and sulfur dioxide emissions, which causes acid rain. It so happens that a young Dick Schmalensee was on the Council of Economic Advisors under Bush Sr. and helped craft those cap and trade markets, and later became dean of the Sloan School. That's the Sloan tie. But from the 80s to 2008, pricing pollution was hailed as the Republican answer for addressing pollution. It was under Obama, when Obama suggested or pushed for a cap and trade market for greenhouse gas emissions, that it became out of favor with Republicans. So all of that is to say that there's a history here for doing the right sets of policies that I think Republicans can get on board with. And that I think that's what keeps me motivated and keeps me excited about this issue.
That is great to hear. And we appreciate the Sloan history lesson as just a reminder of our faculty and alumni and community members are everywhere and really making a difference. Chris, I can't thank you enough for this incredibly insightful session, and to all of our alumni attendees, thank you so much for joining us today. We have lots of programming ahead, so please explore the schedule on the virtual attendee hub for the detailed agenda for the rest of reunions. Chris, thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.